Good afternoon, and welcome to our noon hour panel, where we're talking about making the news and gender and diversity in newsmaking. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and play in these beautiful lands. So thank you for being here today. My name is Christina Casse, and I'm from the City of Vancouver. We are so excited to have you here to be part of the Women Deliver satellite sessions. It's a 4-day event. We're on day 2. It's a now 3-day event focused entirely on gender equity, filled with thought-provoking discussions, workshops, and much, much more. And it's hosted by the City of Vancouver and put on with the generous support of the Vancouver Public Library. So just a quick housekeeping item. In case you do need to use the restroom, it's just outside those doors to the right. And after this session, we would like to invite you to visit a special exhibition on the 8th floor titled Women Deliver Cities. And the display documents the work of 24 local women artists from whom the environment is both their subject matter and their field of action. So if you have some time, please be sure to check it out. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the moderator of today's session, Kathryn Gretsinger.
Thank you very much, Christina. I had a whole thing prepared that I was going to offer, but waking up this morning to the fallout of the coverage of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls stories, I've been reflecting a lot on where we are and what it means to be included or excluded when it comes to media or journalism or citizenship, for that matter. And I thought that I would just begin by saying this is a moment for all of us that is probably coming an awful lot too late. And I want to acknowledge that Angela Sterrett is not with us today. She has an appointment that she has to attend to. But she tweeted something out late last night about what it's like to be an only, what it's like to be one that people go back to again and again and again when these stories surface and come up as an Indigenous woman, and the pressure that that puts on her. And I just want to acknowledge that she is present in this room, though not in body. She's certainly present in this room in spirit, and we'll be thinking of her. And the other Indigenous women journalists and Indigenous journalists and journalists in general who are trying to cover this story in a good way. And that consideration is probably long overdue. We have an extraordinary panel for you this afternoon, and looking at this audience just fills us all up. It was so exciting to walk in and see so many keen people well before start time. So this is a conversation that we need to be having together in media. What do we need to do to think about how we create a media ecosystem? How do we create journalism that is responsive and reflective of our times, of each other, and of different ideas and experiences. The women who are sitting with me today are extraordinary. I've had the great privilege of getting to know each of them over the years. That's what happens when you get a little older, just a little older. But you get to meet people, and you get touched, and you have opportunities to learn in different ways. Charmaine de Silva is absolutely not your typical newsroom boss, not at all. She's a brown-skinned lesbian millennial who has spent her career challenging norms in media. She enjoys blurring the lines between journalism and advocacy and news and media consumption and all of those things. She's the news director at News 1130. She leads one of Canada's largest local newsrooms right here in our own backyard. She was an assistant news director before. She's been an investigative reporter. She's done documentaries. She worked with us at CBC. She's won multiple awards for her work, including National Radio, Television, Digital News Media awards. And she's won awards for pointing out flaws in media. So she's not running around getting awards for making people feel good. She's actually winning awards for challenging people's assumptions and behaviors. So it's wonderful to have her here with us today. Saranaz Barfouroush is someone who I have the privilege of teaching with now at UBC. She is our latest sessional lecturer at the university, about to become an instructor at the university as well. She just completed her PhD last year at the University of Maryland, and her dissertation was all about the dictator and the charmer, US media coverage of Chinese and Iranian leaders. Saranaz has changed the conversation at our school. We've talked for many, many years about inclusion and diversity, and she lives diversity and inclusion. Yesterday she said, what am I missing about this missing and murdered women? What do I need to understand as a young woman who's coming in from away, understanding what is happening in this conversation in Canada? She's asking such important questions and making us think about the way that we operate and make decisions. So I'm very much excited to hear her points of view in this room. And then Erin Millar probably doesn't need to be introduced in this setting. Erin is the brains and the passion and the determination behind the Discourse media. She is a recognized Canadian journalist. She's the founder and CEO of the Discourse. She's trying to actually change the way that we think about and practice diversity in newsrooms in Canada. You may have read some of the work that came out of Discourse last week around what it's like for a young, diverse woman to work in their newsroom, some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that are being created there. Erin has been recognized for her work on intellectual levels, on journalistic levels, and certainly in the community. And it's just marvelous to have her with us today to talk about this important subject. Please help me to strenuously welcome our incredible panel. A panel that would not have been possible even a decade ago. This is change in action right here. So, who's going first, Charmaine? So, I've asked each of our panelists just to kind of plot themselves into the middle of this conversation around diversity and inclusion and give us sort of some thoughts from where they sit about what's going on and where we're at. And then we'll have a meaty conversation with all of you about what needs to change, where we see growth, where we see opportunity, and where we just have to blow something up and do something different. So we'll start with Charmaine, who is no shrinking violet. Hello.
Hello, thank you. Thanks, Kathryn. So my perspective is unique in the sense that I work for a big media company, Rogers, and our newsroom is a large one in Metro Vancouver. We have over 50 people. And so, you know, one of the things that I have and play an important role in is what our newsrooms look like, because that reflects the stories that are told and how we tell the stories. And so that's been a big passion of mine, is to make sure that our newsrooms and the reporters telling the stories reflect our communities. And in radio, that's a challenge, not just, you know, because of Vancouver and what Vancouver looks like. One of the things that I've been passionate about is changing who's on the radio in terms of what they sound like. And we're really proud at News 1130, if you listen to us, and I encourage you to, that we have a diversity of voices of people who come from all over the world. Our overnight news anchor, for example, is from Iran. He has a very distinct accent, and I think in a lot of newsrooms in this country would not get a job on air because of that. We have people in our newsrooms who work for other major broadcasters who, you know, do behind the scenes and writing work for those newsrooms because they've been told because of their accents they'll never be on the air, and we put them on the air. So that's something that I'm quite passionate about. And it's not just diversity in terms of what people look like and sound like. There's also a huge problem in our industry around how we make this profession accessible to everyone. And it goes down to the schools, what types of students are attracted to journalism, how easy we make it for people to learn our craft. You know, in an industry where there isn't a lot of opportunity, you know, who are the people who can afford to work in the gig economy, who can work to suffer through part-time jobs that don't pay a lot. And you look around and you have to ask yourself, are these a lot of kids who can afford to live with mom and dad and suffer through the experience? Are we leaving a lot of people out of the conversation? And so that's something that, I spend a lot of time thinking about. My senior vice president at Rogers for radio, Julie Adam, who's one of the most senior execs in private media in this country, she always asks, what keeps you up at night? And that's one thing that keeps me up at night is what do our newsrooms look like? Who is out there telling the stories? Because those perspectives are so important in how the stories are eventually told.
Thank you very much. Saranaz.
Hi, thank you everyone for being here. So I was a journalist in Iran for 10 years. I haven't been able to do journalism in North America. I did a journalistic project with a school about refugees that were stuck in Turkey, but I come from a perspective of an educator, so I get to meet the young journalists who are about to get into the real world, and we have a lot of conversations about where their place is in the world of journalism, because thankfully a lot of our students come from very different walks of life. Some come from some are local, some come from indigenous communities. A lot of them are recently coming from global communities. So thinking about diversity and how we can kind of include not just different races and ethnicities, but also different abilities into the area of journalism. Who gets, as Charmaine said so brilliantly, who gets to become a journalist is really our main issue right now, because we want people that do have accents. I always tell my students, if you have an accent, that means you're a step ahead, because you already know another language that the person who's making fun of you doesn't. So use that. I was one of those Iranians that I tried very hard not to have an accent. I still do. There are still words I can't pronounce, but I tried to hide it because that was the norm when I was trying to become an international student abroad. That you have to be perfect. You have to have that perfect GRE score or that perfect essay to get into journalism school. And trying to get out from trying to apply to different schools from a country like Iran, you kind of have to keep proving yourself. And sometimes in your career, even as an academic, you're still trying to prove yourself that you're as good. And I think one of the most important things that Kathryn and so many other people in our school do is that we kind of tell our students to be themselves in journalism, to go after the stories and the ideas that they are passionate about. And that has worked well for us, because recently the Discourse helped one of our students actually find a place into their organization. And I think that is what diversity looks like, creating opportunities for students that are different, that are thinking in different ways of telling the story. I think we're moving from a formulated profession into one that means various voices that reflect different abilities, different ethnicities, different religions, and a way to help our students kind of talk about this in the realm of journalism while thinking about ethics, the important values that we hold as journalists.
Thank you. Erin.
Thank you. I'm a journalist first and foremost, who's an accidental entrepreneur. I started my career working for the so-called mainstream media, newspapers mostly. I'm a print journalist, although that sounds very old-fashioned now. I was journalist. And the reason that I became an entrepreneur was because working for magazines and newspapers, I felt like there was a disconnect between my work and the impact that I wanted to have on the communities and the audiences that I served. And I don't think, this was 5 years ago now, and I don't think I had a lot of clarity even at that point about what that disconnect was, but none of us go into journalism for a secure income. So most of us, I would say that I've met, most journalists are really inspired by the impact that they want to have. And so I felt that I couldn't do that within these organizations. So when we started Discourse Media 5 years ago, there wasn't an explicit commitment to diversity that we had. I didn't set out to found a feminist organization. We didn't have an explicit commitment to reconciliation, which we've had since now for 3 years. But something just sort of started to happen somewhat accidentally, is that we put up our shop, Discourse. We started telling stories and being really intentional about being different in our practice in terms of how we were choosing stories and who we were serving and the stories that we were telling. And then and the stories that were most successful were those that were just not being told by the mainstream media, which is a pretty obvious idea. And for example, one of our most successful series to date, which is an ongoing series we've been working on for a couple of years, is like a real deep dive into the systemic issues impacting the families that are caught up in the child welfare system. Of course, Indigenous children are disproportionately represented, and it's a continuation of colonialism and residential schools. And those stories are extremely successful from an audience perspective. So that told us, we started building this audience that looked a lot different than the audience that I was serving at the Globe and Mail and Maclean's, and that told us that there was an opportunity there. Secondly, all of a sudden I found that I had this 80% women work for me, even though I didn't set out to do that, and this very diverse and somewhat subversive staff that we worked for that came to Discourse, and I realized that we were sort of unintentionally attracting these people, and internally we call Discourse rehab, because we're all sort of on the path of rehabilitation from some of our previous work experiences, and that's very real. Like, our staff are, and I think the piece that you referenced from Anita was very cathartic for her to write, because we're all still trying to reprogram ourselves to do journalism in a different way. And we can talk in more depth about what that looks like. So now we have a very, very explicit mission around serving underserved communities, identifying communities that are not being served by existing media, and then trying to build that in. We're a startup, trying to build that in throughout our organization and institutionalize that in lots of different ways. And I'm super excited about that mission, because I feel that as a startup we have a really unique role to play. There's a lot of good intentions right now in Canadian media, I would say that. We've seen the Globe and Mail commit to reporting stories from Thunder Bay. We've seen CBC create CBC Aboriginal. We've seen many, Maclean's attempting to bring in more diverse storytellers. But it's very hard to build that from a legacy organization. I'm really inspired by your work for that reason, because I'm sure it's extremely difficult. I used to work for Rogers, get it? I'm much more of a wrecker. I don't think I could have survived. So as a startup doing it from the outside, I think we have a unique opportunity to be a few steps ahead, to be disruptive, to model a different way of doing it, to be very critical, to call out our industry, others in our industry when needed, and to try to actually come up with some practice change in how everything from our governance model to who owns us, to how we're doing our work, to who's in our newsroom, to the markets that we're serving. So that's what we're about, and thank you for the opportunity to tell you about that.
Thank you. I think what we're hearing as a group is that this is a conversation really about power. Media, whether we're talking about ownership or decision making or editorial controls, is about hierarchies and things being done in ways that are the same and different. And so if we start to think about the question of women and diversity in the sphere of power, where do we need to look to try to make the kind of change that we're all kind of agitating for? Charmaine?
Well, I think of the correlation in a conversation around justice and justices. There's a conversation in our country right now about Indigenous justices and how we don't have enough people on the bench from an Indigenous background. And what it boils down to, though, is that there aren't enough Indigenous lawyers to become justices. So, I still look around newsrooms, and we see far more women, I think, and I know all of you have seen it in the newsrooms that are there, whether you go to the CBC or Global, there's tons of women who work in these newsrooms. But sometimes still, there's a hesitancy of women working journalists to want to sort of go into those positions where you're a decision maker, where you're a hiring manager, where you're sort of shaping the focus or the direction of the organization. I often see, for example, when I had a posting last year for a managing editor, and I had a number of women in my newsroom who I thought would be suitable candidates for that position. Initially, everybody who applied was a guy. And it was, and it's the same stuff that you hear in other industries, right? Where you'll talk to the journalist and say, hey, there's this position, are you interested in it? And it will be women who say, oh, well, I don't have the experience, or I'm not ready, or I don't know sort of how to be there. And the reality is, unless we have those diverse voices around the table helping make those decisions or look at how we do things, things don't happen. And an example I think about for Rogers, that's not necessarily a news example, but last year we received quite a bit of attention after one of our radio hosts in Winnipeg had made a number of really offensive comments around the trans community. And he was fired. And that was just the decision the company took, which seemed at the time, it became news because it seemed odd. It was, people were expecting a big company to our senior VP as a woman, and the perspective she brought was no, there's no room in our culture for this. And I've been in other organizations where there have been talks of people who are big personalities who bring in a lot of either eyeballs or money in terms of advertising, and there's this hesitancy to let them go. And I think it's women around those tables that often push decisions in the right direction. But yeah, I think there's a responsibility from all of us in the industry, in journalism, to have those conversations that women are having in every industry, which is women are capable and should be in these positions. We're just conditioned not to go after it. I think is it just boils down to that over and over again. I'm not ready, I can't do it. And so to me, that's one thing, that sort of development, talent development, succession planning, that we need to do more of, and we need to spot out those people and encourage them to head in those directions. And know that you can do it all. You can still be a journalist, you can still, you can be a manager and editor, you can still produce work, you can manage that and make a difference and show the value of being around that table.
Saranaz, you're a young journalist, but also a young academic working through a very hierarchical system. What are you learning about power and those dynamics and their impact on you and your ability to sort of let yourself be seen?
Right. So I'm glad I signed the contract and not talk. But honestly, I think so. When I first came to the West, I was a young Iranian woman. I'm Muslim, I'm Shia, so I have everything that working against me. So the first thing that I did was obviously question every single thing I wanted to do, because the system was always against me, and I never had the confidence into putting myself forward. I do believe that media magnifies power relations. It really does make you wonder and you've all witnessed this example of when a woman candidate is, questioned, she's questioned about how does she manage life with kids, but the male candidate never gets that question. Now that has become a classic example we use in journalism classes, but unfortunately it's not an extinct one. It still happens. So one of the biggest issues that we face in the issue of diversity is the structural issue, because if you look at the academic work, which there's been a lot, they divide diversity into structure, content, and exposure. But when you think about structure, it's all about ownership. Who's doing what? Who is managing the media voices? Who is hiring the new journalists? Who's hiring in what department? Are the women journalists being hired to do really complicated political stories, or are they again there to do fluff pieces, which thankfully is now not the case in so much. So back to your question, for me it was always about finding the confidence in my voice and in who I am to present what I've achieved, you know, and I couldn't have done that without the help of a lot of women who backed me up, women that were there before me, were not from Iran, but you know, people like Kathryn or my advisor back at my PhD, because these women give you the ability to believe in yourself. And being an immigrant from a country that's often stigmatized, it's very hard to believe in yourself. The first thing you do is doubt yourself, because you know, we talk about, we're in an era that we talk a lot about the Me Too campaign and the issues surrounding her, but I have yet to hear how we are talking about immigrant women who don't have the voice or don't have the confidence to come out and say, you know, I was harassed waiting 6 hours for my passport to be checked at a DC airport. I was harassed. I'm one of those women, but I would never say that. Why? I don't want to get deported. So I won't get deported if I say it, but that is my belief as an immigrant, right? And I think that is really important. It's an important role that the media plays, that giving confidence to the voiceless, giving the power so that the voiceless can come and voice their concerns, their problems. It's really great that all these changes are happening, but I urge you to think about what kind of stories are you hearing from every you know, of the truly marginalized women that never really get to talk about what they've been through in countries that are not their own? No, because the power relations is again it's a very scary thing. I've had friends here who, you know, have very normal bureaucratic things they need to do, but they won't voice their concern for the way they've been mistreated because of being immigrants. And I think when you point them to the kind of work that Charmaine is doing, or Erin is doing, or Angela is doing, it gives them more confidence that, look, there are people to listen to you. All you need to do is find them and talk to them, because they know of ways to tell your story and make a difference.
Thank you. Erin, it was so interesting to watch all the heads nodding as we're listening to our first two speakers. So Erin, as you process what Charmaine and Saranaz are talking about, and as a woman who is a boss, sort of sitting trying to make these decisions, what are you thinking about?
Oh, so many things. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about, like, just in response to what Charmaine was saying about the experience of women not taking that space. And stepping up into that space. I think a lot about the role of culture in that, organizational culture. And, you know, I made a glib comment before about how internally we often call it the discourse rehab. And what I really mean by that is that we've been so conditioned to be disempowered in so many of our professional environments and to be frankly scared. So, you know, the journalists of my generation, there was a really powerful piece that was written by H.G. Watson. I don't know if you read this. Positions women or anyone else who doesn't look exactly like the person who is going to automatically be most successful to be afraid to take a risk. So that's what I'm hearing in that. Is not necessarily that women are always conditioned to not want to have that ambition in an organization like ours. Everybody is like so ambitious and is trying to move forward. In fact, that's sometimes our problem, is that we're button heads over that. But and is just so committed to that. But we all have to constantly remind each other and ourselves that we're invested in each other's success, that we're creating a culture in which it is safe to try something and fail at it. And we think of that, and I think that it's possible because our organization is so dominated by women, and we now describe our organization as a feminist organization. What we mean by that is that we're creating an environment that is very, very different than some of the environments we came out of in media. And you know, media has a lot of work to do to figure out. Our industry has a lot of work to do to figure out what the sustainability of our business is going to be. And I don't think you can do that kind of innovation in an environment that is just not safe to take any risks. So as an entrepreneur, it's not just sort of the moral imperative that drives me to want to create an organizational culture where people have a voice, where just regardless of like what your background is and who you are, that you can take risks, that you can question decisions that are being made, that you have a voice in decisions. It's also just, I think it's just smart business strategy if we want to be competitive. And so that's really there. And I'll just say one more thing in terms of what I'm thinking about is one of the many things that I could talk about that relate to gender equity is, as a startup, we're also raising investment capital. And so I'm a woman who was raised by a mother who told me again and again and again that I'm a special unique flower. I don't suffer from confidence issues. To put it lightly, she still tells me that every day. It's awesome. So I've always sort of resisted the idea that I was being held back by my gender. I didn't like that idea, so I resisted that. And as a white woman, I obviously am not. So I'm not facing nearly the same barriers. But in the investment world, as I've been learning, it's really gender is such a big issue there. 4% of venture funding goes to women-led businesses, even though women found more businesses at a faster rate than men do.
Don't let that one go by. Say that really slowly.
4% of venture funding goes to female-led ventures.
And
we start businesses at almost 50% more the rate of men. We start smaller businesses and boards that have meaningful female participation, and female-founded organizations tend to do better in terms of revenue growth. So the business case is there, but these rooms are very much pitching in these rooms is completely dominated by white men of a certain age, many of whom are very well-meaning and trying to be more critical about their practice, but it's hard. And one thing that really changed for me as I was figuring out how I was going to navigate this world was when I started pitching women. It was like, we have everything we need together, and there's some really unique spaces that we can create together. And I think rather than trying to figure out how I could compete in a male-dominated culture, I'm increasingly trying to figure out how I can be in cultures where I just automatically succeed. So that's one thing. In terms of what I think about doing is to your first question for Charmaine, I think as a white woman, there has been a lot of change in media around diversity, and there's a lot of good intentions, a lot of organizations. The people who have benefited that most are white women. So I think it's important that we know when to take up space and to step forward into positions of power, and know when to step back. And so I'm always thinking about that.
It's so fascinating how layered all of this is. I'm sitting here, and I hope this is okay. I'm about to bring one of my students into the room. Stephanie Wood is sitting in the front row. She's working right now for the National Observer, a young Squamish woman who has been such a leader at our school. As we have sort of learned to listen and learn to collaborate and learn to follow instead of leading as teachers and learners. And Steph has been writing about what it means to really listen and respectfully engage in communities and engage in conversations that people have to this point largely ignored. So I just want to acknowledge your leadership in this. And I think that is such an important point that Erin's making. If we're to do what Charmaine is suggesting and to change up the dynamics within newsrooms, we probably need to look at the way that newsrooms are organized in the first place. And we probably need to find ways to not only change who's at the table, but what happens at the table. So how do we do that, Charmaine?
Well, part of it is throwing out the rule book, right? One thing that became really clear to me very early on is sort of, and you mentioned this, Erin, there are a lot of white women in power in the newsrooms that I've worked in. I've had bosses and supervisors that have held that space, but who have decided to play by the same rules that the white men set up and said was okay. I have on my team right now a really talented and passionate journalist who came to us from the CBC, and I'm sure many of you read a recent piece in the Globe and Mail that talked about the casual culture of the CBC, and this is a newsroom that I worked in for several years, and it was my dream to work there, as is I think a lot of journalists. And one of the things that this journalist told me was about, and it resonated with me because it's this dream that you have, and you get there, and the actual working environment doesn't live up to the dream. And your supervisors, your bosses, you look around, they're women. They're the decision makers. They're the ones who are pulling the strings, making the hiring decision. but you're told the same messages that, I think really for decades have always been there. So if you've been a casual for 5 years and you don't get an opportunity to do anything and you have to live 12 weeks by 12 weeks, suck it up. This is just the way it is, that there's no other way of doing it. Instead of having a conversation about, is this really fair and do we need to change this? If there's a whole generation of journalists and 20% of your workforce is living and working this way, doesn't this need a rethink? Don't we need to sort of change things? And I think what when Erin said, and Kathryn both, about just changing what we do, it's not just about being at the table. One thing that I took a lot of people by surprise when I came into this position at News 1130 a year ago is, around decision making and questions about directions we were going in. And me just asking, well, can we do that? And everybody would turn to me and say, you're the news director. You get to make the call. But I was so conditioned to having a conversation. My style is about, bringing people in, let's have a conversation about it, make a decision together. And nobody was used to that around the table. They were just used to having someone telling them what to do. And they still joke about it. The big joke is, well, you're the news director, you can tell us what to do. I do think it is about changing how we do things. And it's a process. I've been in this role for 14, 15 months now, and we've made a number of changes, but we have so much more work to do. And it feels really good, and sometimes it can be disheartening when you look at what you're, and for us, part of that conversation too has been about embracing who, what our identity is as a station. So News 1130 is an all-news radio station. We do headline news, and the reality is most of our audience lives in the suburbs and they're commuters. That's who our audience is. But what a lot of people don't realize is a huge part of our audience is actually ethnic. We have a huge following amongst South Asian and Asian listeners, and part of it is cultural because we just get to the point. We don't spend a lot of time talking about stuff.
So no hand wringing here.
To quote Francis Beulah, who has 30 minutes to listen to a radio doc about hemp tampons? It's that sort of mindset. We get to the point. And one of the things that I noticed is, despite who our audience is, we weren't telling stories that reflected our audience many times. And so I think part of it is that perspective, changing how decisions are made, who's at the table. It's all part of it. And sometimes you just have to take the plunge.
And Saranaz, this is something that we've been trying to work at UBC, create these opportunities to try new things. What are you observing in the work of the students and in the change that they're making in their small projects and even in the bigger collaborations?
So we are extremely blessed because we have been always kind of, since I've joined UBC since 2017, we've seen students that are very eager in critical thinking, and I think that is a blessing for anyone who wants to get into journalism. The idea that you are questioning things that you're being given, even solid information, is important. I think what we've done that has worked was that kind of creating the idea that no matter what story you're working on, if it's a finance story, if it's a story about mortgages, there needs to be an array of voices in your story. Otherwise, you're not going to get credit, because we are educators. We have, we have stuff to bribe them with and to scare them with. But it's interesting because once we have that conversation about why is it that you're only interviewing the South Asian communities sometimes when it comes to a festival or when it comes to a certain day, why aren't you talking to them about mortgage rates? Why aren't they being? Why is the Chinese community only in your story on the Chinese New Year? They live in this town, they pay taxes. Or the Iranian, we can go on and on. But what's really interesting is not only all the great points that Charmaine made that need to be done, but it's really interesting that academics and people who study, diversity in news have done a lot of work on guidelines and how-tos, but the problem is that in journalism, because there's such a disconnect between academia and the profession, it would really help if these two forces could join together and kind of use, because sometimes what we say in academia and in our studies might be too far-fetched for journalists, and sometimes what journalists are saying on the ground might be, well, we've already talked about this in so-and-so book, and if you really go and read it, you can really help your organization change. So I think one of the big points of change could be these two forces coming together. And also the idea that in journalism schools, we are asking students to take a different look at how they tell their stories, who they find experts. We're having a huge discussion right now at the school about who is an expert. If you are doing the political story from a very problematic country, are you choosing the right experts to make your point, or are these experts paid by a certain government, even if it's the Canadian or the American government? So it's really important to have discussions about students and who sources are, what they mean, what kind of sources, and what kind of people get into specific stories. That is, I think, something that we've been, especially this year, really successful in.
Thank you. Erin, the idea of privileging particular voices has been a problem in journalism for a long time. We hear sort of a voice from above, or a voice from power, or a voice from money, or a combination of those. How do we change the conversation to privilege different kinds of voices in an ongoing way? And I'll get Erin to answer that as we privilege your voices, because I want to actually have a meaty Q&A for the last 15 minutes that we're together. So Erin.
Sure. So I'll answer that in two ways. One, just talk about what's different about our model. We don't get to the point. We're focused on local journalism. So what we're focused on is coming up with a new sustainable digital model for local journalism that serves communities that are being underserved by existing media. We're currently in 3 communities. Those 3 are really our laboratory in which we want to develop what is a sustainable and replicable model that we can then bring to many communities across Canada. The 3 communities are the Cowichan Valley on Vancouver Island, a rural community that has had a lot of its coverage cut back by the newspaper swaps between the newspaper chains. The urban Indigenous community in the Lower Mainland, and Scarborough in Toronto, which 600,000 people, very diverse. And our model is really about challenging the power structure of how stories are chosen and whose voices are in those stories. So I think the best way to explain how we're different is to describe what we're not, which is, so I started my career at Maclean's magazine. How we would choose stories is that I would, as a reporter, I would think up some idea organically, I guess. I might read it, I might hear somebody say something to me, whatever. I might workshop it by talking to my friends about it over a dinner party. Then on Monday, I'd go into a meeting with about, 16, 20 people. We all had a similar education. We all lived in downtown Toronto. We were disproportionately white compared to the audiences we served, and we would decide what Canadians needed to know. That was how it happened. And so at the Discourse, we're working on practice change, developing new processes that actually empower our community to tell our investigative and our data journalists where to direct their resources. Investigative journalism is very expensive, and so we don't want to go and do a big investigation on a topic that isn't actually responsive and reflective of the communities that we serve. And so we do this in lots of different ways, right from developing our topics out of ongoing community interviews that we do every week. We have a data set at the center of this where we identify topics that there seems to be a demand for information. Then our journalists do what they do best, which is develop those into project concepts and pitch them back to our community. Our community members actually vote on which topics they want us to investigate. And then there's opportunities for them to participate in the production of that work in lots of different ways. So for example, the project that I was describing about child welfare earlier, we have had different young people who have had some interaction with the child welfare system, involved in that in lots of different ways, and it's affected our work and made our work better, as much as I hope that it's also supported their career and their own storytelling abilities. So we're just constantly trying to create opportunities to bring people into the newsroom. And then the second piece I'll just end on is also, obviously, we're working to build a very diverse team of, like, I think about diversity, it's being diverse in terms of who we're serving explicitly, the stories that we're telling, who decides what those stories are, who decides which voices are heard in those stories, who are the storytellers, who are the journalists, the newsroom. I think a lot of the time, media ends at who are the storytellers. I've heard anecdotes from Indigenous reporters that I've had a pleasure of getting to know, for example, working in some large organizations where they're like, okay, well, I'm here, I got the job, I guess, check mark on that, but I can't actually advance any of the stories that actually reflect my community in this structure. And so what we're very much focused on is like constantly keeping that conversation, because it's hard and we don't have all the answers. And so a lot of it's just about ongoing conversations that are extremely uncomfortable. And I've had a lot of uncomfortable conversations in the last 5 years. Internally, that's like we nurture the environment in which that's okay, is to have some conflict around these things. I just had pulled up something from Twitter I read earlier today. Tiara Fraser, who's an amazing local Métis woman who's done a lot of organizing around media and amplifying Indigenous women's voices in media, posted today a definition of white fragility. I don't know if you've all heard of this term, but it really resonates with me. White fragility is the discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice. We saw this in spades yesterday with the word genocide. It became personal for many, many white people in media to acknowledge that word and what it meant, and that prevented some people from having the kind of conversation that we needed to have. And so we're trying to find space to make that okay. Like, I do get defensive sometimes in some of the conversations I have within my own organization when confronted by some of the people in my organization who are pointing out when I'm off track. But it's okay. We can have that, and my employees know that they can come to me and challenge my decisions on things, and that will not risk their jobs. And I know that they can come to me and challenge me, and I can sometimes respond poorly in moments of stress or whatever, and that they still respect me at the end of the day. And because we've created that, by calling out white fragility, I think we've been able to move forward.
Thank you. Okay, those of you in the audience, okay, yes, please. Can I get you to stand up and we'll take questions, and I'm sure that the conversation is going to go on as well. So,
my name is Teja. I've been thinking about stories of immigrant women. I had an immigrant woman myself. Questions about telling stories is one thing, but then I've also been thinking about who has the right to hear these stories and witness these stories. Are they really meant for like mainstream journalism? What about exclusive spaces where women can tell their stories? I'm just curious to hear all of your perspectives on the reader too, and on the audience too, who gets to witness certain stories, especially when told by underrepresented communities.
Well, for me, I think part of the answer is, the person telling the story, what are they comfortable with? If someone wants to tell a story for an exclusive audience because that's where they feel safe, and that's where they feel supported, and that's the community that they want to have this conversation in, I think that's great. And I think that's important, right, to have those spaces. There are other people who want to tell those stories to a wider audience. And the newsroom that I work in is one that has a huge audience. So we do have those conversations, though I can tell you, where sometimes we meet people who have an interesting story to tell, and maybe my boss and the bosses above won't like this, but I have directed people to other organizations or other journalists if I feel like their story is going to be better served by that medium. And I think that's important. I think that's important for journalists to think about that, because it's not always about getting the credit for the story or the byline, and it's about who can tell a story. Actually, I told someone to contact Angela just this weekend about a story, because I know that Angela would do a better job than me in telling that story. So I think part of that is being okay with it. Everything doesn't have to be equal and accessible to everyone, and that's something that we need to feel comfortable with. And the other thing, I think part of that conversation is about the emotional labor. And you raised this, talking about Angela, who, you know, I wish she could be here today, but I understand as well. You know, we go to the same people, we ask the same people to tell the same types of stories. And after a point, sometimes people don't want to tell those stories to everybody. They just want to be in the environment in which they feel safe. And I think it's important for all of us to be respectful of that and really work with communities to tell the stories in the way they want to tell them. And I think in being respectful to people, that's the only way really eventually we'll hear more of these stories at all. It's that safety.
I kind of know what you mean. I agree with what Charmaine said, but I do think that in some communities, there is such stereotypes that are embedded in the public understanding of that community that sometimes when there are stories told about the Iranian community out in the open, I get very bothered because I'm like, oh God, that stereotype is going to be repeated. Is that what you were? Yeah, especially because sometimes we see ourselves as a family and you don't want to air your dirty laundry to everyone, but you still want to solve it within your family. So there are some stories that I sometimes do disagree with them coming out in the open just because there's not enough context built on why, for example, when I first came here, there was a fight between two groups of Iranians on a political issue, of course. And the headline of the Globe and Mail, I believe, was that, you know, the Iranian community got into it. I can't remember it, so if you Google it and I'm wrong, don't tweet. But just what I remember of the context was that, oh God, these Iranians are at it again, you know. But the reality is that there's such a deep context because of what happened that day, that as an Iranian with my community, I want to talk about it. But having it out in an open without that context, and it was written, a lot of stories that do come from Iran aren't written by Iranian American or Iranian Canadians or Iranian Americans, but they've never actually lived in the country, right? They're not immigrants. They've been born and raised here, and that's great. But there are some grievances that I have to face that they don't, right? Because I'm on a visa or I'm on a PR or whatever. But I think that from your question, I do believe that it is people from that community can tell the story much better, but that doesn't mean that we're free from giving context, right? Just because you have an immigrant reporter or a indigenous reporter or a woman reporter reporting on issues related to that community doesn't mean, okay, we're done, we did our job. We still need to build a lot of context. Right now, with the political atmosphere, there's so much polarization that it's very important you know the journalist who's telling the story, right? And I think that is why I believe that's a really great question. And I do think it needs a lot of attention on who's telling the story and what kind of stories are being told about a stigmatized community.
Just in the interest of time, I'll go to the next question, and Erin, maybe you can start with answering the next question. Yes, please.
Thank you. Question about context. It seems to me that in politics, the question period style is very confrontational. But in journalism, it's also based looking for competent stories a lot of the time. And we're talking about doing things differently. And I'm wondering if this is one of the areas where we might be doing things differently.
That's actually the real reason I started Discourse was working at the Globe and Mail at that time and feeling like I was constant. I reported on education. I've been doing so for about a decade, and feeling like I had the idea of some stories that were really about how the system in education was shifting, the challenges it was facing, but also the ways it was getting around it. We actually have a really excellent education system in Canada. So why are the only stories I was telling were about like conflict and crisis, right? Like it just didn't make sense. And so I would publish stories and I'd get all this feedback from people saying, okay, yeah, that's right, like, you got the symptom, but did you hear about this school, and did you talk to this educator who was working on something, and have you seen this interesting pedagogy research? So there was like so much material there that I wasn't finding opportunities to report on. And I think actually this flows really well from the question that you asked too, and your comments, which is journalists, particularly those in like an advertising-based model where there's a lot of pressure to put out a lot of content all the time, we rarely have an opportunity to stop and reflect on our work. Your question about like who should be telling these stories and for whom in what spaces, the question that I think about is like, okay, why? Like, what is the impact of the story that we're trying to have? And journalists rarely have an opportunity to ask that question. And so there's times where absolutely a story needs to reach a really big audience to have the impact that it's going to have. There's other times where the purpose of journalism and the impact of journalism can literally be to just have a story heard in a small group of people. Like, and I'm thinking again of our child welfare work, where our reporter Brielle Morgan, who's just a fantastic reporter, has been following the case of one mother's battle through the court system to regain custody of her children. And it's one story, and she's reported it exhaustively over a year. But it's a story that really resonates with a lot of people. And so she started getting so many different people reaching out to her saying, will you tell my story, will you tell, like dozens of people from across Canada. And so then you stop for a moment and you say, okay, like what is the point just to like show conflict, or like what is the impact that we can have with these stories? And there was no way that we had the capacity to tell all those stories. So Brielle, she created a workshop series where she invited parents that were impacted by the system to come together to learn about media, to like learn to be connected to other journalists who might tell their stories, so like similar to what you were doing, etc. And what she found was the actual value of this space was just the parents telling each other their stories. It didn't actually need media for what they needed to achieve. They needed to be heard. They needed to know that their story wasn't. They weren't alone in it. They weren't. And that was the power that they pulled from to be able to continue advocating for their families' needs and rights. And so there's lots of different impacts that can come. Often we only think of, we celebrate the journalism investigations that like reveal some secrets that were held by some powerful man and then he was toppled. Like that's kind of the theory of change about the world that model implies is that like everything that's holding us back in terms of our communities finding solutions is a bunch of powerful men who have secrets, right? Like that makes no sense. So journalism, I mean, there's some of them, I'm sure, but there's just a lot of different ways that journalism can act to have a positive impact on our democracy and on communities and the change we want to see. And I just think, I hope that one of the things that happens as the business model shifts is that there's more space built in for journalists to actually pause and reflect on the impact of their work.
One of the great promises of journalism is that it is a way to mobilize a grand public conversation and create spaces in which we can listen to one another. I'm so grateful for all of you for being here. I want to give the last word to each one of our panelists. What should people expect from the media when it comes to women and diversity? What should people expect?
I always get to go first.
Saranaz go first.
I think people should expect what they want to. I mean that's the reality is that different people want different things because we're diverse, and we shouldn't expect just one model, one example of doing things. I applaud the work that the Discourse is doing for that specific reason, and we need that. We also need our station, and we need, the Globe, and we need the CBC, and we need all of those different voices doing things. But I think people should expect that as an industry and as media, we have an obligation to tell more stories, not just stories that appeal to most people, not just stories that are going to get a lot of clicks and make money. I think all of that is important, and I'm going to add that we should expect that journalism should be not just a rewarding career, but one that people can actually expect to work in, make a living, and feel like they're treated well. And so journalists need to hold their organizations to higher standards so that people don't, I hear that the whole rehab thing, like recovering journalists, all of those things that people say, that's what breaks my heart. And that's why I'm so passionate about what I do, because I don't want to hear, young, amazing storytellers leave and go into other industries because of the way they were treated. And so, yeah, that's what we should expect.
Thank you.
I think transparency and humility is what we should expect from media. One of the great myths of journalism, in my opinion, is this idea of that objectivity is an absolute. And for me, what that means is that that is said by people who can't see the air that they're breathing. For me, objectivity is believing that there is only one way to tell a story, only one approach to that. And so I think of objectivity as a tool that we can use, but that comes from, there's no view from nowhere. There's always a view from somewhere. That story is always being told by someone. The choices are being made by someone. So I don't think we're ever going to get it perfect. I think there's a lot of work to be done. I agree that we need all of these organizations to be thinking about this and bringing different things to the table to change the system. But I do think we should expect our media organizations to be transparent about where they're actually at and where they're coming from and why they're making the decisions that they are, and then have some humility. Journalists aren't that good at that. And I'll just end by, as a startup, I want to make sure that you all have the opportunity to subscribe. Okay, great. Yeah, my colleague Lindsay, we publish a weekly newsletter that is reflecting on some of these issues and talking about our efforts and the efforts of others to build a more sustainable ecosystem. So if you're interested in receiving that newsletter, Lindsay will give you that opportunity. Thank you.
So a should question is a bad question for an academic, because we can go on and on. But what I really think, in addition to everything that this incredible woman has said, is context. I do think that there's a danger that with social media and all these TOVs that we think, okay, context is out of the door and we don't need to build the understanding over stories. I think we need to find, and our students are, and our journalists are finding ways to add context to, it's been said that people only have 43 seconds to give you on a piece. Studies have shown that's your beginning of your attention span. So if we don't capture you in that 43 seconds, we're done. But that doesn't mean that our responsibility as journalists is over. And we don't have to build context or understanding over the important stories per se. And also, it's not just important to have one diverse voice from one community. These communities have various diverse voices we were just discussing, and it's important to try and include all of them, or most of them at least, in the conversations we have about marginalized communities. It's not just one perspective, and I think that's very important to keep in mind.
I wish we had much more time. Please hold up young women and LGBTQ++ people who are trying to do this work. Please hold up people from diverse communities who are the onlys in our newsrooms still. And please understand that sharing power is a good thing. Thank you very, very much for spending in for these leaders today. Thank you very, very much.